My parents disrespected me at their wedding anniversary, so I left and never came back. My name is Laura Miller, I am 32 years old. And 3 weeks ago my parents stood in front of 30 guests at their 40th wedding anniversary dinner and announced that they were taking the whole family to Hawaii the following week for another celebration. Everyone clapped, my younger sister Rachel squealed. And I smiled while picturing palm trees and ocean air, already thinking about how it would be my first real vacation in years. Then I made the mistake of asking a simple question about what time our flight would be. My father John looked at me like I had spoken in a language he did not understand. My mother Elaine tightened her smile. And in front of everyone my father said that I did not need to know because I was not part of the trip. Someone had to stay behind and take care of the kids. 30 faces watched while my family made it clear that I did not truly belong. What they did not know was that I had a secret I had been building for 3 years. And that night I decided it was finally time to use it before everything unraveled. The Miller family looked perfect from the outside. We lived in a white colonial house in the suburbs outside Boston. 4 bedrooms, 2-car garage, a lawn trimmed to perfection. The kind of place that announced success without needing words. My father John had retired from his role as a bank branch manager 3 years earlier. My mother Elaine had never worked a paid job but was always busy managing church committees and neighborhood events while guarding what she called the family reputation. My sister Rachel was 3 years younger than me, married to Thomas Reed, a corporate attorney whose job title was mentioned in nearly every conversation. They had 2 children, a 5-year-old named Ethan and a 3-year-old named Lily. And a new luxury SUV that always took the prime spot in my parents' driveway. My 10-year-old sedan stayed on the street. Elaine always asked me to move it because guests noticed the driveway first. And I never argued. Being the invisible one in a family teaches you not to question the small things, the better chair at dinner. The way my mother introduced Rachel by her husband's career while I was simply Laura who helps out. I worked as a part-time accountant with remote clients and flexible hours and modest income. Nothing impressive by Miller standards, and I never told them about the other thing I did. The thing I started 3 years ago when my life collapsed in a quieter way. I never told them that I had learned how to see helping out in my family meant arriving at holidays before sunrise to cook and clean. Setting tables with china I was not allowed to use, polishing silver, coordinating meals. While Rachel arrived later dressed perfectly and waited to be served. At Christmas I wrapped every gift because my mother said her hands hurt. Even though nothing stopped her from playing bridge several times a week. Birthday parties meant I ran games, cleaned messes, and watched the kids while Rachel took breaks she said she deserved. The one time I asked to skip an event because of a work deadline my mother reminded me that family came first and sacrifices were necessary. Except I was always the only one making them. The truth settled in slowly. One year my Christmas gift was a glittery apron that read "World's Best Aunt." Rachel gave it to me proudly, and I wore it every time I cooked or babysat. Not because I loved it but because it fit the role they had already chosen for me. The realization hit one quiet evening while I was scrubbing a pot after another family dinner. I could not remember the last time anyone invited me somewhere without expecting work. And that memory pulled me back to the moment my life had first cracked. 3 years earlier I had been with a man named Mark for 4 years. We talked about marriage and a future until one evening he sat me down and told me he loved me but was no longer in love. He said I was always just there, like furniture. After he left I wandered into a pawn shop and bought a used camera with money I should have saved. I told no one. That camera became my secret. I began photographing people most others ignored. Tired workers, elderly women waiting alone. Hands worn from labor. I called the project Invisible Women and shared it through an anonymous account. Over time thousands of people followed, people who understood what it meant to be unseen. I kept the camera wrapped in a scarf in my closet. The only thing I ever kept just for myself. 3 weeks before the anniversary dinner an email arrived from a gallery in California asking about my work. I almost deleted it, convinced good things did not happen to people like me. The only person in my family who ever truly saw me was my Aunt Helen, my mother's younger sister who had moved west years earlier to open a cafe and pottery studio. Elaine called her the family disappointment. But Helen was the one who encouraged my photography, who told me my work mattered, and who admitted she had shared my page with a gallery owner named Daniel Brooks. The same man who had emailed me. When she told me he wanted to discuss a solo exhibition my hands shook. And that night I finally replied. The anniversary party arrived with a week of preparation that I managed. Flowers ordered, place cards written, tablecloths pressed. I arrived early on the day itself wearing clothes meant for work not celebration. By evening the house glowed with candles and perfection. I changed into a simple black dress and my mother reminded me to stay in the background. Guests filled the rooms. Rachel arrived fashionably late to admiration and applause. I moved through the crowd serving food, answering questions from people who thought I worked for the caterer, and taking the children when asked without thanks. When dessert came I realized no one had saved me a plate. And shortly after my father stood to make his announcement. He spoke about family and milestones before revealing the Hawaii trip. Everyone reacted with excitement, and for a moment I believed that I was included. I stepped forward and asked about the flight. And the silence that followed felt heavy and sharp. My father told me I was not going. My mother explained that someone had to stay with the kids. And my sister avoided my eyes. I smiled because I had learned how. But something inside me shifted later in the kitchen. Rachel told me not to be upset and handed me lists and instructions like it was already decided. And that night when the house finally went quiet I found an email thread on my mother's laptop discussing me as free help. Words that stripped away the last illusion I had. I took screenshots, drove home, and sat alone in my apartment realizing that they did not see me as family but as staff. And staff can resign. I called Aunt Helen in the middle of the night and told her everything. She listened and then offered me a room above her cafe and reminded me that I could choose myself. By morning I was packing my bags, leaving behind the apron and the life that had kept me small. For the first time I was making a different plan. I drove back to my parents' house 2 days before the Hawaii trip with my car packed heavier than it had ever been before. The morning was gray and quiet. And inside the living room my mother was spreading outfits across the couch while Rachel scrolled through resort photos on her phone. My father sat in his chair with the newspaper folded open like a shield. I stood in the doorway and said that I needed to tell them something important. My mother barely looked up and assumed it was about the children's schedule. I told her it was not. And that I would not be watching the kids because I was leaving for California the next day for work. The room froze. Rachel stared at me like I had spoken nonsense. My mother asked what I meant by leaving, and my father finally lowered his paper. I said it was a professional opportunity one had been building toward, something that mattered to me. And I said it calmly because I had practiced the words all night. Rachel immediately said she was counting on me and that plans had already been made. I told her those plans were made without asking me. And that I would not cancel my life because everyone assumed I did not have one. The silence pressed in hard. My mother stood up and accused me of being selfish and reminded me that family came first. I repeated her words back to her and reminded her that family apparently did not include me when Hawaii was announced. She opened her mouth and then closed it. My father warned me not to expect a warm welcome if I left. And for the first time I understood that his approval had always come with conditions. I said I understood and meant it. Because something inside me had already stepped away. The next day was filled with messages that grew more dramatic with every hour. My mother left voicemails saying I was tearing the family apart and that my father was devastated. Rachel sent texts filled with tears and guilt telling me she did not understand why I was doing this to her. And then came the message that was meant to wound, telling me I would end up alone just like Aunt Helen. I stared at it for a long time before realizing that Helen was not alone at all. She had built a life she loved on her own terms. And suddenly that comparison felt like a promise instead of a threat. I turned off my phone and focused on packing. I walked through my apartment one last time while the sun was still low, 3 suitcases by the door. My camera equipment wrapped carefully, my laptop tucked away. Everything else stayed behind, the furniture. The walls that had held me while I waited for permission to exist. I left my spare key for the landlord, loaded my car, and drove away without looking back. The streets were empty and quiet. And for the first time the silence felt like space instead of loneliness. The drive across the country unfolded slowly. I did not rush it. I stopped at roadside motels and small diners where no one knew my name or my role. Somewhere in the middle of endless land I pulled over and watched the sky change colors and took a photograph just for myself. My phone buzzed once with a message relayed through Rachel saying my mother would cut me off if I was not home when they returned. I deleted it without replying. Because I was already gone in every way that mattered. When I called Aunt Helen from a gas station she told me my room was ready and that Daniel Brooks wanted to meet me the day after I arrived. The certainty in her voice steadied me, and when I finally crossed into California the ocean appeared like a wide-open answer. I rolled down the window and breathed in air that tasted different. I cried then, not from sadness but from relief. And when I pulled into the driveway of Helen's cafe she was waiting with her arms open and said welcome home. And for the first time that word fit. Life in Carmel settled into a rhythm almost immediately. My room above the cafe was small and bright with a window that looked out toward the water. Helen explained that I would work mornings and that the rest of the day would be mine. The first morning I tied on a simple apron and learned how to pour coffee. Customers came and went, locals greeted Helen by name. Tourists lingered over pastries, and no one expected anything from me beyond the moment in front of us. By noon I was tired and smiling more than I had in months. That afternoon I walked to the gallery to meet Daniel Brooks. He greeted me warmly and spoke about my work with a seriousness that made my hands shake. He showed me through the space and talked about the Invisible Women series with respect and understanding. He stopped in front of one image and said it was the reason he reached out. And when he told me he wanted to offer me a solo exhibition my chest tightened with disbelief. He explained the terms clearly and fairly. And when I saw my name printed on the contract as an artist I felt something inside me finally settle into place. I signed the agreement with sunlight streaming through the windows and walked out holding proof that what I had built in secret was real. While I was preparing for the exhibition my family was discovering what my absence meant. Without me the Hawaii trip fell apart in small frustrating ways. The kids were restless, routines forgotten, details missed. Messages started arriving asking for information I had always carried for them. I did not respond. I was too busy printing proofs, choosing frames, and meeting a journalist who wanted to tell my story. 6 weeks later I stood in the center of the gallery surrounded by my photographs. The opening night felt unreal. Guests moved slowly from piece to piece, music played softly. And when I saw the first red dot appear beside a photograph my knees nearly gave out. Someone had bought my work. By the time the night unfolded furthermore pieces sold, conversations flowed. And I felt seen in a way I never had before. In the middle of it all the door opened and Rachel and Thomas walked in looking lost and out of place. Rachel rushed toward me with concern that felt rehearsed. She said they had been worried and that our mother had been searching for me. Thomas nodded politely like this was a networking event. Rachel looked around at the gallery and asked when I started doing this. And I told her it had been years she never noticed. Aunt Helen stood beside me like an anchor while Daniel watched from across the room. Rachel leaned close and told me she was pregnant again and that she needed me to come home. The word needed echoed loudly. And I realized she still saw me as a solution, not a person. I told her calmly that I would not be coming back and that this was my work, not a hobby. I told her a piece had sold for thousands and that my work had value. The room grew quiet, applause followed from strangers who understood what my family never had. And I felt something lift that had been pressing on me for decades. My parents arrived soon after. My mother tried to take control of the space with familiar authority. My father hovered uncertainly, accusations followed about abandonment and selfishness. And I finally said out loud what I had carried silently. I read their own words back to them about free help and gratitude. The truth settled heavily in the room. And for once my mother had nothing to say. The people around us saw clearly. And the family image she protected so fiercely cracked in front of witnesses. When they left, the gallery felt lighter. I sold more work that night than I ever imagined. Daniel told me it was an opening people would remember. And as I carried the unsold pieces back upstairs with Helen, I looked at the check on my desk and knew it was proof that I had never been nothing. I had simply been unseen, and now that was changing. The days after the gallery opening passed in a blur that felt unreal yet grounding at the same time. Every morning I opened the cafe with Aunt Helen and poured coffee for people who knew my name for reasons that had nothing to do with usefulness. Locals asked about the photographs and tourists lingered longer than planned. I spent afternoons editing images and answering emails from Daniel Brooks, who spoke to me like a professional equal. Not a favor case, not a helper, an artist building something of her own. The sales from opening night settled into my bank account a few days later. I stared at the number longer than I expected. Not because of greed but because it represented time and care finally respected. It was more than I made in months of accounting work. And it came from something I created quietly while being told I had nothing important to do. I printed the statement and placed it in a drawer beside my contract like a reminder that reality had changed. News traveled back east faster than I anticipated. Messages came from distant relatives who had never spoken to me directly before. Some congratulated me awkwardly, others asked if it was all a phase. I answered politely when I chose to answer at all. Rachel sent a short text saying she hoped I was safe and that things had been stressful since Hawaii. There was no apology and no acknowledgement of the words that pushed me away. I read it once and let it sit unanswered. Learning that silence could be a boundary to me. Mother Elaine called several times. Each voicemail layered with accusation wrapped in concern. She said she did not recognize the person I was becoming and warned that pride often leads to regret. My father John left one brief message saying he wanted to talk when I was ready. His tone was uncertain, like a man realizing the script he relied on no longer worked. I listened and deleted most of it, keeping only what felt honest. Not manipulative. The magazine interview came next. The journalist spent hours asking about my work and my process. She listened carefully when I described seeing people others overlooked. She did not ask about my family until the end, and even then framed it gently. The article that followed focused on art and choice rather than scandal. When the issue arrived with my name printed boldly, I held it with shaking hands. Not from fear but from recognition. People began to write to me after the article appeared. Women who had carried families quietly, siblings who had been expected to fill gaps without complaint. Their messages were not dramatic but steady and grateful. They told me they felt seen by the photographs and by the story behind them. Reading their words, I understood that my work was larger than me. It held space for many who had learned to disappear. Rachel reached out again after the birth of her daughter. She sent a photo and a message that read softer than before. I replied with congratulations and sent a gift card. Nothing more. There was a moment where I considered saying more. Explaining boundaries and pain, but I stopped myself. Explanations had never changed anything before, action had. And my action was distance with kindness. My father surprised me weeks later with an email that held no demands. He said he had read the article and that he was proud of me. 3 sentences only, simple and unadorned. I read it several times and felt a quiet ache, not reconciliation but acknowledgement. I replied with a thank you and nothing else. Because I was no longer willing to chase approval that arrived decades late. Work continued steadily. Daniel scheduled meetings and introduced me to collectors who spoke about my images with curiosity and respect. One requested a commission photographing the coastline near her home. Walking those cliffs with my camera, I felt aligned with my own footsteps. No rush, no obligation beyond seeing clearly. The photographs that emerged felt stronger and more intentional. Like I was finally standing in my own frame. Aunt Helen watched all of this unfold with a calm pride that steadied me. She never pushed or praised excessively, she simply showed up every morning with coffee and commentary. Reminding me to eat and rest, reminding me that art required a life around it. Not just ambition. In the evenings we talked about clay and light and the courage it takes to choose oneself without becoming hard. The cafe. Regulars learned my schedule and began requesting the small table near the window where I edited photos between customers. They asked thoughtful questions and shared their own stories without expectation. It was a quiet community built on presence rather than performance. Something I had never known before. As months passed, my relationship with my family settled into a distant shape. Holiday cards arrived with careful wording, texts came on birthdays without pressure. I responded politely and kept my boundaries intact. The urge to fix things surfaced occasionally but faded faster each time, replaced by a steadier sense of self that no longer depended on their understanding. One afternoon I found an old photograph while organizing files. A self-portrait taken years earlier in my Boston apartment. The woman in it looked tired and small, waiting. I studied it for a long moment before deleting it. Not out of anger but closure, she had done what she could with what she had. And now it was time to honor who I had become. The second exhibition began to take shape under a new theme. Boundaries. Daniel supported the direction fully and helped refine the selection. Each image explored edges and thresholds. Doors half open, hands releasing, light meeting shadow. It felt honest and personal without being confessional. Work that spoke without asking permission. On opening night of that show the energy was calmer but deeper. Conversations lingered, collectors returned. And I moved through the space grounded and present. There was no family drama this time. Only the quiet confidence of belonging where I stood. Sales followed steadily and I accepted them with gratitude rather than disbelief. Later that night as the gallery closed, Daniel told me my name was being mentioned more often in serious circles. Not loudly but consistently. He said that kind of recognition lasted longer. Walking back to the cafe under a sky softened by mist, I felt something close to peace. I understood then that freedom was not a single dramatic moment but a series of choices made daily. Choosing what to answer and what to leave. Choosing where to place my time and my care. Choosing to be seen without shrinking. My family still existed in my life but no longer defined it. I had built something of my own and it held me steady. Sitting in my studio weeks later with the Pacific stretching wide beyond the window, I adjusted a print and smiled softly. The camera that started it all rested beside a newer one. Both reminders of where I began and where I stood now. I was not rich or famous but I was present and visible, and that was more than enough. The weeks following the second exhibition unfolded with a steadiness that felt unfamiliar but welcome. My mornings still began before sunrise with the smell of coffee and the sound of the ocean drifting through the open window. And my afternoons filled with editing sessions and meetings that treated my time as something valuable. Not flexible in the way my family once used that word. Daniel continued to advocate quietly for my work, introducing it to people who asked thoughtful questions and listened to the answers without looking past me as my schedule filled. The absence of constant family demands became more noticeable. There were no last-minute requests to rearrange my day. No assumptions that I would step in without being asked. The silence where obligation used to sit felt strange at first. Almost empty, but gradually it turned into space. Space where I could decide what mattered and what did not. Space where rest was not something to earn. Rachel tried again to bridge the distance in small, careful ways. She sent photos of her children and updates that were neutral and tentative. Sometimes she added a line saying she hoped I was happy. And I believed she meant it even if she did not fully understand what happiness looked like for me now. I responded kindly but briefly, learning that closeness did not have to mean access. And that maintaining distance could still hold compassion. My mother Elaine remained the hardest presence to navigate even from afar. Her messages shifted from anger to wounded concern, then to nostalgia. She spoke of holidays and traditions as if they were proof of unity rather than habits built on my labor. I listened without engaging deeply, recognizing the familiar pull to explain myself, and resisting it. Because explanation had always been her doorway back into control. John reached out occasionally with neutral updates and questions about my work. His tone lacked warmth but also lacked accusation. It felt like a man learning how to speak without authority. And while it did not heal the past, it allowed for a new limited connection. One that did not ask me to return to who I was before. Professionally, opportunities continued to open. A regional publication requested a feature on the Boundary series. And a small museum expressed interest in acquiring one of the pieces for a rotating exhibit. These moments brought excitement but also responsibility. I learned to slow myself down and choose carefully. Guided by Helen's steady reminders that growth did not need to be rushed to be real, the commission photographing the coastline deepened into a project that pulled me outward and inward at the same time. Walking alone along cliffs and coves, I noticed how land met water without apology. Edges existing without needing permission. The images reflected that quiet confidence. And when I delivered the final set, the collector responded with gratitude rather than ownership. A dynamic I had never experienced before. Living above the cafe continued to ground me. The routine of opening doors and wiping tables reminded me that art was part of life, not separate from it. Customers recognized me and asked about new work without expectation. Some shared stories of their own families and choices. These exchanges were brief but meaningful. A reminder that connection did not require sacrifice of self. One evening after closing, Helen and I sat together shaping clay in the studio. She spoke about her early years of doubt and the criticism she endured for choosing an unconventional path. She did not frame it as regret or triumph, just reality. Listening to her, I understood that choosing oneself was not a single rebellion but a lifelong practice. One that required patience and honesty. The holidays approached quietly. My first without returning east. I expected loneliness but found something gentler instead. I decorated my small room with simple lights and shared a meal with Helen and a few close friends. There was laughter without tension and conversation without roles. I realized that celebration did not need to be loud to be full. On the day my family usually gathered, I received a group message wishing me well. I replied with warmth and left it there. Later that night, I walked along the beach and watched the waves move steadily under the moon. The absence of obligation felt like freedom rather than loss. As the new year began, Daniel proposed planning another exhibition farther south. The idea thrilled and scared me. We discussed timelines and themes carefully. He emphasized that my voice mattered more than momentum. Hearing that affirmed the trust we had built. One grounded in respect rather than extraction. Rachel called unexpectedly one afternoon, her voice hesitant. She spoke about exhaustion and fear and the weight of expectations she had never questioned before. She did not apologize directly, but she listened when I spoke about boundaries and choice. The conversation ended without resolution but with a shared understanding that something had shifted. And that was enough for now. After the call I sat quietly processing the mixture of emotions. Compassion for her struggle and clarity about my limits. I recognized that caring did not require compliance. And that love could exist alongside refusal. This understanding felt like a muscle strengthening with Yuzumi. Mother attempted one last reach through guilt, suggesting that my success was temporary and that family would always be my safety net. I did not respond. The idea of safety had changed for me. It now meant autonomy and honesty, not proximity to people who diminished me. Work filled my days with purpose rather than pressure. The studio became a place of calm focus. Prints lined the walls, each one a conversation with light and shadow. Sometimes I paused to remember the woman I had been when I first picked up the camera, invisible even to herself, and felt gratitude for her persistence. As spring arrived, the town brightened with color and movement. Tourists returned, and the cafe buzzed with energy. I balanced it all with care, protecting time for rest and creation, learning that sustainability was as important as ambition. One afternoon, while organizing files, I found the screenshots of the old emails. The words that once shattered me, I read them again without the sharp pain they once carried. Then deleted them, not out of forgiveness but release. They no longer held power over who I was becoming. Standing in my studio that evening with the Pacific stretching endlessly beyond the glass, I felt grounded in a way I had never known. My life was not perfect or easy, but it was mine, built with intention rather than obligation. And for the first time the future felt open without being overwhelming. I understood that reconciliation might come or it might not, and that either outcome would be survivable. My worth was no longer tied to usefulness or approval. It lived quietly within the choices I made every day, choices that honored who I was and who I was still becoming. By the time the next exhibition opened, my life had settled into a shape that felt intentional rather than reactive. My days moved with a rhythm I trusted, mornings at the cafe greeting familiar faces, afternoons in the studio shaping images with patience, evenings walking along the coast letting the sound of the waves steady my thoughts. The urgency that once drove me to prove my worth had softened into confidence that did not require witnesses. The third exhibition drew a quieter crowd but a more committed one. Collectors who returned because they followed the work rather than the story. Conversations unfolded slowly and thoughtfully. People asked about process and intention instead of price first. Daniel stood nearby observing with satisfaction. He told me later that this kind of audience was what sustained an artist long term. Not spectacle but trust. Sales came steadily and without drama. Each red mark on the wall felt less like disbelief and more like confirmation. I accepted congratulations without shrinking and without inflating myself. I thanked people and meant it. When the gallery closed that night I felt tired in the best way. The kind of exhaustion that comes from presence rather than depletion. Life with Aunt Helen continued to be a quiet anchor. We shared meals and conversations that ranged from trivial to deeply reflective. She never claimed credit for my choices and never framed herself as a savior. She simply offered space and belief, and in doing so taught me what support actually looked like. Encouragement without control. My relationship with my family remained distant but civil. Updates arrived occasionally and I responded when it felt right. My father sent another short email months later saying he hoped I was well and that the garden back east reminded him of my photographs. I read it slowly and felt something like peace. Not reconciliation but acceptance of what was possible. Rachel reached out again after some time had passed, this time not with need but curiosity. She asked about my work and my life without framing herself at the center. We spoke briefly and carefully. I sensed her questioning long-held assumptions about roles and fairness. I did not guide her or rescue her. I simply shared my experience and let it stand. Elaine remained largely silent. Her absence spoke louder than her words ever had. I accepted it without bitterness, understanding that not everyone chooses growth even when it is offered. Letting go of the desire for her validation freed me more than any confrontation could have. The cafe community continued to grow around me. Regulars asked for updates on exhibitions and commissions. Some brought friends specifically to see my work. Others simply enjoyed knowing the person behind the camera. I learned that being seen did not require performance. It required honesty and consistency. One afternoon a young woman lingered near the counter after her coffee. She told me quietly that my story had helped her leave a situation where she was always the helper and never the priority. Her voice shook with both fear and relief. I listened and told her she was allowed to choose herself. The moment stayed with me long after she left. As summer approached, Daniel shared plans for future opportunities beyond the region. Conversations about travel and expansion surfaced. We approached them thoughtfully, ensuring that growth would not recreate the same patterns of overextension I had escaped. Success meant nothing if it came at the cost of self-erasure. In quieter moments I reflected on the path that led me here. The years of invisibility, the night everything cracked, the courage it took to leave without guarantees. I no longer viewed that version of myself with sadness but with respect. She survived what she could and kept going until something better was possible. One evening I found myself sorting through old belongings and came across the world's best aunt apron folded at the bottom of a box. I held it for a moment then donated it without ceremony, not out of anger but closure. It no longer represented me and never truly had. Standing in my studio later that night I adjusted a frame and stepped back. The photograph captured light meeting shadow at the edge of land and sea. Boundaries clearly defined yet fluid. It felt like a visual summary of everything I had learned. That limits were not walls but shapes that allowed form and meaning. I was not rich or famous and I did not need to be. I paid my bills with work that mattered to me. I rested when I was tired. I said no when I meant no and yes only when it aligned. My life no longer revolved around proving I was worthy of a place at someone else's table. The future felt open without being frightening. Whatever came next would be approached with the same care and self-respect I had learned to practice. My family existed in the background now as part of my history rather than my definition. Looking out at the Pacific as the sun dipped low, I felt grounded and present. The camera rested easily in my hands, no longer a secret or an escape but a tool of expression. I had built a life that could hold me, not because anyone granted permission but because I finally gave it to myself. That was the real resolution. Not revenge or triumph, just freedom, the quiet, durable kind that grows stronger over time. The kind that comes from choosing yourself and standing by that choice, again and again.